but we are going to go ahead and get started. And let me formally welcome everybody to this month's session of Gulfstream Legal's Poolside Chat, Unleashing Your Inner Genius session. Today, we're going to be talking about search term validation and the science behind that search term validation, why this is so important, and why it's such an exciting topic actually for me and my guest today. So let me actually formally welcome Lindsay. Lindsay, thank you so much for joining me today. We've got a great group with us today. I'm going to let you introduce yourself because you could do an even better job than I can.
I don't know about that, but thanks for having me, Ari. I'm Lindsay Hodge. I manage the eDiscovery department for Hall Booth Smith Law Firm, which is based out of Atlanta. I work out of the Little Rock office, but manage the practice area nationwide. And Ari, unfortunately, has known me for a lot of years and worked with me for a lot of years. So the fact that he's even letting me do this is, amazing.
Oh, Lindsay, come on. You need to give yourself some better credit than that. Well, perfect. So we're going to dive right into today's top topic. And so search term validation. We've been talking about this for a very long time, and I don't just mean you and me, but let's kind of dive into this and why we're taking this deep dive into the science behind it. So let's kind of start at the beginning. Search term validation. In e-discovery, when we talk about this, we're referring to kind of that process of assessing and confirming the effectiveness and the defensibility of search terms used to retrieve relevant electronic documents during various legal investigations or litigation. We all know this kind of as a critical step in the e-discovery workflow to ensure that the search process is accurate, reliable, comprehensive. By validating search terms, all of our teams are minimizing our risk of missing important documents, our favorite word, false negatives, or including the irrelevant ones, false positives, thereby improving the efficiency and defensibility of our e-discovery process. Now, Lindsay came to me a little over a month ago and said, "Hey, Ari, we talk about search term validation itself on a regular basis. We talk about it in our cases, but we really don't talk about the scientific approach and how it applies to each of our cases." And before Lindsay kind of joins me, I want to kind of remind everybody, the key part to this is we're really talking about the scientific approach. Let's all go back to elementary school, middle school, high school, and college if you had to take some of those biology and chemistry class and talk about, what was the scientific approach. We originally talked about, the formulation of a hypothesis, designing and validating your experiments, execution of the validation of those experiments, and of course, analyzing the results of those. If those four things sound very familiar, they should, because it was the foundation for what we have always talked about for search term validation. This is the truly systematic and evidence based approach to how we actually reliably validate our search terms. So, Lindsay, for you, not just at this practice, but in your in your past life, why has search term validation been so critical, and what has been so fascinating for you about, starting to take that deeper dive into the science behind how we actually deploy this before we talk about the science itself?
So, yeah, on the legal side, I think we're always looking for efficiencies. Not only because the volume of data in the ESI that we deal with has grown exponentially since we all started doing this. So, we're dealing with larger amounts of data on a regular basis. Um, with that, the deadlines haven't extended, just the amount of stuff to get through. So I think it's really important to know what you're looking at. I mean, the worst thing ever is to get into a review and at the end you realize, oh, I had a 30% responsiveness rate for my review. That means I reviewed 70% of my data set was not even needed, essentially. So that is not cost effective for the client. It's not efficient for anyone's time. And so, really having a defensible way to look at the data and then why it's defensible so that you can defend it if you need to, is super important. And I think it's becoming more and more common with other uses of technology in conjunction with it, just in the amount that we have to deal with now. So that's really what drove my interest in it.
No, I love that. And so we're gonna before we get into really your practical tips for everybody that's joining us today, and strategies that people can really deploy. Let's talk just a little bit about the science itself. When it comes to search term validation and eDiscovery, there's been several different kind of key metrics that play a critical role in assessing the accuracy and defensibility of your results. So these metrics provide kind of that objective measure to evaluate the effectiveness of search terms, ensure a true comprehensive evaluation. Now, the three terms you're going to mention today, probably everybody that's on the call with us today has heard these at least once, but let's kind of discuss these three key terms and what they mean and how they kind of apply to search term validation, because I really feel like it's one thing that's skipped over on a regular basis. And I know we'll talk about why they're skipped over many times, but
So yeah, I mean, precision recall and F1 score. I've heard that so many times that you would think I'd be able to recite it by memory, but I almost have to look every single time to make sure I'm not mixing them up. So when we're looking at precision, we're looking at the percentage of correct categorization of relevancy of a term. So in other words, if your term, think it's gonna yield this number of responsive documents, we're looking to see how many of those after review of a sample set are actually responsive. And that's going to get you your percentage of accuracy in that bucket. And then when we go to recall, this is going to be your percentage of responsive documents or relevant documents of a term versus the entire set. So you're looking on in a smaller bucket for precision, and then recall is your overall. So how many documents did we miss by using the term that we did? Not necessarily out of that term, how many were responsive and right, but how many did our term not get? And then your F1 score is going to evaluate both of those together and give you it's I look at it like a balancing act. It's going to kind of mesh those together in a way that can tell you quantified what you did, and if you need to make adjustments, which is more important to you, and it depends on the case, precision or recall. And that allows you to really look at your data and kind of make adjustments where you need to.
so I love that. That was short and concise, and it's great notes that everybody can keep, because precision recall and the F1 score should never be something that's difficult for you to get when you're conducting your search term validation. I would hope whatever tool you're using has easy access to those three baseline metrics, besides giving you, the total documents, the unique counts, things like that. How often, I'm kind of curious, and I know we didn't kind of chat about this before. How many cases and how often do you get the opportunity to ask a vendor, like in our relationship or in the cases that you handle, for these three metrics? And do you ever get an opportunity to be able to use these and discuss them with your legal team?
Not as much as I would like is the answer. Unfortunately, a lot of times timing of a case drives that and doesn't allow us the time to do validation. But when we do, if I know I'm going into a case and I'm pretty sure I'm going to have to use search term validation, we'll talk about why later and how I figure that out. But if I know that, I'm actually shopping around for the people that have the best methodology, can explain it the best, and not only that, their science is strong, but on the back end, the reporting is in a way that is useful, that we need it in our case. So your science could be strong, but if you don't present the data in an accurate manner on the back end and show what you did and be able to defend it, then it's still not usable in my opinion. So those conversations happen. I would say a lot of times it leads to either not being able to do it due to timing or other reasons. But the follow up is what we're trying to do better at as well. How did it work? Let's look back on it. What did we use? How did it work? Was it worth it? And things like that. So those are metrics that we're really starting to track now.
I love it. I mean, I talk about all the time considering precision, recall, and F1 score. And I think there's three terms that everybody can take and associate with that. Just as you said, what is your precision? That is the quality of your search. What is your recall? That is the comprehensiveness of your search. And I love the term that you use for F1 score. That is the balance. I mean, and I think if we keep it that simple, even though it can be some fairly complex math behind the scenes, you know, having these three pieces of information even presented as part of a dashboard will really enable you to optimize your discovery processes and ensure accurate and my keyword that I talk to a lot of my clients, and I know we've talked about on a regular basis, is a defensible outcome, which is what we're all trying to go. So now let's kind of transition into really what we wanted to talk about today, which is some practical tips and strategies that the people that joined us today, what can you do to get to here? And to understand why some of these, tips and strategies are important, let's understand, trying to use these things is a careful balancing act. Just as you mentioned, you may not have time to evaluate all these things, but does that necessarily mean that you should not even take a quick look? If your vendor or the software that you're working with doesn't present you this information in an automated fashion, is it doing you fair justice when it's returning your searches so that you even have a idea of trying to understand what's going on? So I always talk about developing a comprehensive understanding of the case, but it's not just familiarizing yourself with legal requirements, case objectives, and data sources. It's truly making sure that you have a clear understanding of the context so that you can select the appropriate terms, so that when you see the output of those terms, you're able to understand, hey, my quality is way down, or my comprehensiveness is way down. I'm not hitting what I'm expecting based upon the context of my particular documents. Because those data sources might dictate right away you're not going to get a good quality of results out of it, no matter what you do, unfortunately.
And a lot
So
of
what
times if we don't validate, if we don't run this actual process, we can get quality, but we're not seeing any documents that we didn't deem relevant in review, right? So you're
Yep.
missing that piece of it on the back end. You never have that piece of knowledge. You can say, "Oh, hey, I had 10,000 documents and, 6,000 were responsive and we ended up producing them," but you don't know how many aside from the 10,000 that were actually responsive that you never even looked at. That's what
so
you can't quantify when you don't do it.
so there's another question, and something I'm going to go down a tangent, something we haven't discussed, because I think you just hit on the key point. How often, when you do have metrics like this, whether you're able to use them up front or not to run search term validation, and you get all the way through your production, do you ever get the opportunity to go back and look at that production set that was actually reviewed and compare that to your search term validation and say, we did a pretty good job of understanding the quality of our documents?
So I run quality metrics throughout an entire review. It's one of the things I report on regularly. So whether it's depending on the length of a review, whether it's daily, weekly, I'm looking at my responsiveness rate. I'm looking at how many docs we're reviewing an hour. That's what tells me when we're going to finish. I'm looking at how many documents are actually being produced versus are responsive and things like that. So I'm running those metrics in real time, whether the dashboard is set up for me to easily see it shown to me, or I'm just doing the math myself. But the other piece after production, I can tell you very little happens because it's on to the next. And that's one thing that I would love to have more time to do, is really go back and evaluate the processes and look and see where you could be more efficient and where you could have done things a little bit differently or methodology could have helped you. So that's one thing that I would say not nearly enough in my practice.
Interesting. So, in talking about some other kind of useful practical tips, two of the big ones that I talk about on a regular basis is always start with broad search terms and iterate. Even before you're talking to your case team, you as a expert, as a professional, should work through some of those processes, test some of your initial searches, look at some of those results, and work to figure out how you can refine it. Along those lines is kind of one of my second tips, which is using statistical sampling. Do you ever get an opportunity to do any statistical sampling to help validate your data set?
Sometimes, sometimes I will be honest, there's just not time. It is, we get documents and it's go, go, go review. Other times we're able to poke around a little bit and take a sample set, a certain predetermined size of documents or a percentage of the document set or whatever, and kind of see and run the STR and look at those terms within the documents, and are they catching stuff I didn't really think it was going to catch? Should I, maybe revise that a little bit? Or yeah, that's what I wanted. So sometimes with with a nice deadline that doesn't make me, want to run screaming from the building, yes, I do have that ability, so, and do that pretty often.
So I know one of your biggest challenges is time. And I know for everybody else on this call, we're always up against one form of a deadline or another, whether it's later today, an hour from now, tomorrow morning, next week. You know, how does time play it into search term validation for you in a lot of your cases? And what are some tips that you can provide to the team that help you kind of find that as best as possible the balance between the I got to do this and move on, and I really want to dig into this to make this as efficient as possible.
Well, I think it's case specific as well, and what you're looking for, the type of review that you're doing. So that plays a part, of course. But time is huge. I would say that's the biggest factor of using it or not using it. More than anything, because if we have a deadline and we have a certain number of documents to get through, I can't take 3 weeks to run a search term validation process, even on a small sample of documents, to then get me to terms that I know are going to be good, but then have to review that data set that is yielded from those terms. So if you've got a production deadline that's just too close, there is no sometimes ability to go back and revise and make changes. It's all hands on deck, just get this done within the given deadline. So that timing plays a huge part, and also volume of data. So depending on what your starting size is, what you're even running terms against, there's a big difference in 1 million documents and 10,000 documents, and whether you want to validate. That validation process isn't going to take you as long, because it's not going to make your set as large on 10,000 as it will 1 million. Um, so, kind of working with you guys and other vendors and saying, "Hey, what's my threshold here? What number of documents would I have to review that's going to get me to the statistical averages where we can say, "Hey, this is the level you need to be at, and we can give you a good accurate score." And how long would that take? Do I have someone available that can review those documents within the amount of time to make revisions and then get to a review set? That's huge too. We're working with the case experts, which is usually a partner on the case or associate on the case or whoever, is requesting this work done. They are the case expert as far as what's going to be a responsive document or not. And they are the ones in my practice that I have look at it. And one person, so there's no conflicting results. If it's either responsive or it's not based on someone's individual assessment of the document, just let the system learn one way.
So tying this all back into kind of some of that scientific approach, we talk about documentation, especially maintaining detailed documentation throughout your process. And everybody in litigation knows documentation is key. So what are some of the documentation pieces that you try to do on every single one of your matters? Store away someplace for useful bit later that's going to give you information that you need to quickly access at the touch of a button.
So, like I said, I do review metrics. whether I'm sending them to anyone or not, if I'm just doing them for myself, on each review that I do, whether it's 500 documents or 5 million, it doesn't matter. I've got review metrics. I know all of the people that reviewed documents. I know what level of review they did. So I know what they reviewed for, whether it was just responsiveness or a full production review with privilege and everything else included. I keep responsiveness rates. So I kind of track with our internal reviewers. When we have an internal review, especially, I like to know what's our average rate, like how many documents, so that I can accurately put the number of people that need to be on it to get finished by a completion deadline that we have to meet. So I'm tracking all of those things on a case by case basis. I wish I tracked more, always, because I love data, but those things specifically every single time.
Interesting. So in talking about the stuff that you're tracking, I talk all the time about using data visualization techniques, ways
Mhm.
to display information, present information, to help gain insight into the performance, identifying patterns, visualize the distribution of relevant documents across your sets. For me, I find visual representations help in understanding and interpreting kind of the outcomes of each of these steps, especially in search term validation. So, what visualizations have you found that you've deployed, if any, that have been successful for you? Whether it's just a standard report or a graph chart, you know, what sort of things have actually worked for you in the past?
So as far as the search term validation goes, I rely on you guys for the visual representation because I like how your reports look and that's what I want it to look like and how I want to present it after. So,
And I
tricky
promise I'm
question. I
not
see
paying
what you did
Lindsay.
there. I see what you did there. No, but seriously, I mean, I know that sounds so trivial, but the reporting is huge because that report may be something that you have to attach to emotion or
Yep.
present to the judge or make someone understand that's looking at these graphs and these numbers with a bunch of words like recall and precision and they don't know what that means. So it's huge the way that you present your data, even though everything may be right, if it looks like not good, nobody wants to look at it or automatically invalidates it, right? So
Yep.
the reporting is huge. And I do mean that genuinely, like your reporting is great, and not only the science and the methodology that you guys use is great, but that piece is important as well. Um, I personally don't do the reporting on or do the graphing on search term validation because like I said, I get it from you guys, but on the other processes, I like to me personally, I keep even though I could do it in relativity with the dashboard setup, I tend to keep everything in Excel and make pivot tables and charts and if I need to present that information to the firm or if I'm doing a webinar, I have that at my fingertips. That's why I keep all of the data on the front end.
So I think you hit kind of two key points. Besides, I'll thank you for the shout out to the Gulfstream team, of course. But I think going back to your idea of having experts, sometimes your experts you're going to find in-house. Other time you're relying on experts, we know, with your software provider, your vendor. It's not always your software itself. So having a team that you're working with, and I like to push this as well, because no matter who you're working with, you want them to be able to understand, how do I grab this information to present it to you in a useful manner. No matter how much you understand what's going on behind the scenes, or how good we all have become in Excel to manipulate the display the data, again, as you mentioned with time, you don't always have the time to do that work. So making sure that you have a group that you're working with that can give that to you as part of their customization to the application, I personally, that's one of my tips. That's critical. So you
And
must ensure.
that's huge, and that goes to, so you've got this period of time that you've got to do this validation process, but on the front end, you can have one of your team, whether it's you guys or another vendor, working on you make that clear on the front end. If you're going to do validation, okay, but at the end of this, these are the things I expect to see on the reporting, and this is the format that I want it in. And that gives them enough time to create it in that way so that when you are done with the process, they've already got that set up and it's output in the way that you want it. So that's another tip. If you're going to do it, start that earlier. Don't wait till it's finished and then say, oh, but I really want this included or I want it to look like this. Do it on the front end.
Well, perfect. Well, Lindsay, I know we've got about 5 minutes, and before I start to wrap things up, I do want to give people that have joined an opportunity. Anybody who's out there, if you have a questions, comments, thoughts, while Lindsay and I are here, please feel free to type into the chat, and we'll be glad to discuss it. Any of your specific thoughts. While I give the audience an opportunity to come up with questions if they have any. I do want to kind of thank everyone for joining Lindsay and I in this our initial topical exploration of the science of search term validation and eDiscovery. I really do want to invite you to ask any questions that you have, share your insights, experience, things like that. But most importantly, I want to kind of invite you and welcome you to look out in the upcoming weeks and months here. Lindsay and I are collaborating on a broader deep dive into this topic that we've been talking about today and started to highlight. In some of these other formats, we're going to get the opportunity to delve a lot more deeper into the latest research and insights into search and validation. We're going to present a whole bunch of new key studies summarizing the advancements recently being made, highlight some of the new emerging trends and methodologies that are here, broaden out kind of some of these tips and strategies that you're going to be able to deploy yourself using this technology. I'm going to get the opportunity to nerd out a little more than Lindsay will allow me on this particular session and take a deep dive as part of our white paper into the science behind the validation, introducing and explaining the math behind some of these thoughts. And I really want to also talk about, that we're going to be exploring really how you can use these critical metrics for achieving accurate and defensible results. Precision recall and F1 score, I really think are underutilized just because a lot of the times people don't know how to access that information as part of their daily case and how to interpret that very quickly and simply to deploy it on their case. So I will say with that, Lindsay, thank you so much for joining me and all of
Thanks
our
for having me.
guests today. It's a pleasure as always. I know we're going to be face to face next week, having some more conversations, including a special shout out to somebody who's in the audience today. I will see you next week. To all of our audience members, thank you so much for joining me. We will not have a webinar in June, but I hope you will join me again in July for our surprise topic, which I find is going to be another exciting one with another special guest. Lindsay, again, thank you so much for joining me today,
Thank
and I will
you.
see you next week.
Thanks.
Have a good one.